In the book Ascent of Money, you give a history of the world through the lens of money. If the financial system is evolutionary in nature, much like life on Earth, what is the origin of money on Earth?
The origin of money predates coins. Most people kind of assume I'll talk about coins, but coins are relatively late developments. Back in ancient Mesopotamia, so I don't know, 5,000 years ago, there were relations between creditors and debtors. There are even in the simplest economy, because of the way in which agriculture works. Hey, I need to plant these seeds, but I'm not going to have crops for X months. So we have clay tablets in which simple debt transactions are inscribed. I remember looking at great numbers of these in the British Museum when I was writing The Ascent of Money. And that's really the beginning of money. The minute you start recording a relationship between a creditor and a debtor, you have something that is quasi-money. And that is probably what these clay tablets mostly denoted. From that point on, there's a great evolutionary experiment to see what the most convenient way is to record relations between creditors and debtors. And what emerges in the time of the ancient Greeks are coins, metal, tokens, sometimes of valuable metal, sometimes not, usually bearing the imprint of a state or a monarch. And that's the sort of more familiar form of money that we still use today for very, very small transactions. I expect coins will all be gone by the time my youngest son is my age, but they're a last remnant of a very, very old way of doing simple transactions.
By the way, when you say coins, you mean physical coins.
I'm
Because
talking
the term
about
coins has been rebranded into the digital space.
Yeah, not
as well.
coin-based coins, actual coins. You know, the ones that jangle in your pocket and you kind of don't know quite what to do with once you have some. So that became an incredibly pervasive form of paying for things. Money's just a crystallization of a relationship between a debtor and a creditor, and coins are just very fungible. Whereas a clay tablet relates to a specific transaction, coins are generic and fungible. They can be used in any transaction. So that was an important evolutionary advance. If you think of financial history, and this was the point of The Ascent of Money, as an evolutionary story, there are punctuated equilibria. People get by with coins for a long time, despite their defects as a means of payment, such as that they can be debased, they can be clipped. It's very hard to avoid fake or debased money entering the system. But coinage is still kind of the basis of payments all the way through the Roman Empire, out the other end into the so-called Dark Ages. It's still how most things are settled in cash transactions in the early 1300s. You don't get a big shift until after the Black Death, when there's such a need to monetize the economy because of chronic labor shortages and feudalism begins to unravel, that you just don't have a sufficient amount of coinage. And so you get bills of exchange. And I'm really into bills of exchange because, and this I hope will capture your listeners' and viewers' imaginations, when they start using bills of exchange, which are really just pieces of paper saying, I owe you over a 3-month period while goods are in transit from Florence to London, you get the first peer-to-peer payment system, which is network verified, because they're not coins. They don't have a king's head on them. They're just pieces of paper. And the verification comes in the form of signatures. And you need ultimately some kind of guarantee. If I write an IOU to you, bill of exchange, I mean, you don't really know me that well. We only just met. So you might want to get it endorsed by, I don't know, somebody really creditworthy like Elon. And so we actually can see in the late 14th century in northern Italy and in England and elsewhere, the evolution of a peer-to-peer network system of payment. And that's actually how world trade grows, because you just couldn't settle long oceanic transactions with coinage. It just wasn't practical. All those treasure chests full of doubloons, which were part of the way in which the Spanish Empire worked, were really inefficient. So bills of exchange are an exciting part of the story, and they illustrate something I should have made more clear in The Ascent of Money, that not everything used in payment needs to be money. Classically, economists will tell you, money has three different functions. You've heard this a zillion times, right? It's a unit of account, it's a store of value, and it's a medium of exchange. Now, there are 3 or 4 things that are worth saying about this, and I'll just say 2. 1, it may be that those 3 things are a trilemma, and it's very difficult for anything to be all of them. This point was made by my Hoover colleague Manny Rincon-Cruz last year, and I still wish he would write this up as a paper because it's a great insight. The second thing that's really interesting to me is that payments don't need to be money. And if we go around, as economists love to do, saying, well, Bitcoin's not money because it doesn't fulfill these criteria, we're missing the point that you could build a system of payments, which I think is how we should think about crypto, that isn't money. It doesn't need to be money. It's like bills of exchange. It's network-based verification, peer-to-peer transactions without third-party verification. When it hit me the other day that we actually had this precedent for crypto, I got quite excited and thought, I wish I had written that in The Ascent of Money.
Can you sort of, from a first principles, like almost like a physics perspective, or maybe a human perspective, describe where does the value of money come from? Like, where is it? So it's a sheet of paper or it's coins, but it feels like in a platonic sense, there's some kind of thing that's actually storing the value, as us a bunch of ants are dancing around and so on.
I come from a family of physicists. I'm the black sheep of the family. My mother's a physicist, my sister is. And so when you ask me to explain something in physics terms, I get a kind of little part of me dies because I know I'll fail. But in truth, it doesn't really matter what we decide money is going to be. And anything can record, crystallize the relationship between the creditor and the debtor. It can be a piece of paper, it can be a piece of metal, it can be nothing, it can just be a digital entry. It's trust that we're really talking about here. We are not just trusting one another, we may not, but we are trusting the money. So whatever we use to represent the creditor-debtor relationship, whether it's a banknote or a coin or whatever, it does depend on us both trusting it. And that doesn't always pertain. What we see in episodes of inflation, especially episodes of hyperinflation, is a crisis of trust, a crisis of confidence in the means of payment. And this is very traumatic for the societies to which it happens. By and large, human beings, particularly once you have a rule of law system of the sort that evolved in the West and then became generalized, are predisposed to trust one another, and the default setting is to trust money. Even when it depreciates at a quite steady rate, as the US dollar has done pretty much uninterruptedly since the 1960s, it takes quite a big disruption for money to lose that trust. But I think essentially what money should be thought of as is a series of tokens that can take any form we like and can be purely digital, which represent our transactions as creditors and debtors. And the whole thing depends on our collective trust to work. I had to explain this to Stephen Colbert once on the Colbert Show, the old show that was actually funny. And it was a great moment when he said, so Niall, could I be money? And I said, yes, we could settle a debt with a human being. That was quite common in much of history, but it's not the most convenient form of money. Money has to be convenient. That's why when they worked out how to make payments with cell phones, the Chinese simply went straight there from bank accounts. They skipped out credit cards. You won't see credit cards in China except in the hands of naive tourists.
how much can this trust bear in terms of us humans with our human nature testing it? It seems that, I guess the surprising thing is the thing works. A bunch of self-interested ants running around, trading in trust. And it seems to work, except for a bunch of moments in human history when there's hyperinflation, like you mentioned. And it's just kind of amazing. It's kind of amazing that us humans, if I were to be optimistic and sort of hopeful about human nature, it gives me a sense that people want to lean on each other. They want to trust.
That's certainly, I would say, probably now a widely shared view amongst evolutionary psychologists, network scientists. It's one of Nicholas Christakis' argument in a recent book. And I think economic history broadly bears this out, but you have to be cautious. The cases where the system works are familiar to us because those are the states and the eras that produce a lot of written records. But when the system of trust collapses and the monetary system collapses with it, there's generally quite a paucity of records. I found that when I was writing Doom. And so we slightly are biased in favor of the periods when trust prevailed and the system functioned. It's very easy to point to a great many episodes of very, very intense monetary chaos, even in the relatively recent past. In the wake of the First World War, multiple currencies, not just the German currency, multiple currencies were completely destroyed. The Russian currency, the Polish currency. There were currency disasters all over Central and Eastern Europe in the early 1920s. And that was partly because over the course of the 19th century, a system had evolved in which trust was based on gold and rules that were supposedly applied by central banks. That system, which produced relative price stability over the 19th century, fell apart as a result of the First World War. And as soon as it was gone, as soon as there was no longer a clear link between those banknotes and coins and gold, the whole thing went completely haywire. And I think we should remember that the extent of the monetary chaos from certainly 1918 all the way through to the late 1940s. I mean, the German currency was destroyed not once but twice in that period, and that was one of the most advanced economies in the world. In the United States, there were periods of intensely deep deflation. Prices fell by a third in the Great Depression, and then very serious price volatility in the immediate post-World War II period. So it's a bit of an illusion. Maybe it's an illusion for people who've spent most of their lives in the last 20 years. We've had a period of exceptional price stability since this century began, in which a regime of central bank independence and inflation targeting appeared to generate steady below 2% inflation in much of the developed world. It was a bit too low for the central bankers' liking, and that became a problem in the financial crisis. But we've avoided major price instability for the better part of 20 years. In most of the world, there haven't really been that many very high inflation episodes and hardly any hyperinflationary episodes. Venezuela's one of the very few, Zimbabwe's another. But if you take a 100-year view or a 200-year view, or if you want to take a 500-year view, you realize that quite often the system doesn't work. If you go back to the 17th century, there were multiple competing systems of coinage. There had been a great inflation that had begun the previous century. The price revolution caused mainly by the arrival of New World silver. I think financial history is a bit messier than one might think. And the more one studies it, the more one realizes the need for the evolution. The reason bills of exchange came along was because the coinage systems had stopped working. The reason that banknotes started to become used more generally, first in the American colonies in the 17th century, then more widely in the 18th century, was just that they were more convenient than any other way of paying for things. We had to invent the bond market in the 18th century to cope with the problem of public debt, which up until that point had been a recurrent source of instability. And then we invented equity finance because bonds were not enough. So I would prefer to think of the financial history as a series of crises, really, that are resolved by innovations. And in the most recent episode, very exciting episode of financial history, something called Bitcoin initiated a new financial or monetary revolution in response, I think, to the growing crisis of the fiat money system.
Can you speak to that? So what do you think about Bitcoin? What do you think it is a response to? What are the growing problems of the fiat system? What is this moment in human history that is full of challenges that Bitcoin and cryptocurrency is trying to overcome?
I don't think Bitcoin was devised by Satoshi, whoever he was, for fear of a breakdown of the fiat currencies. If it was a very far-sighted enterprise, because certainly in 2008, when the first Bitcoin paper appeared, it wasn't very likely that a wave of inflation was coming. If anything, there was more reason to fear deflation at that point. I think it would be more accurate to say that with the advent of the internet, there was a need for a means of payment native to the internet. Typing your credit card number into a random website is not the way to pay for things on the internet. And I'd rather think of Bitcoin as the first iteration, the first attempt to solve the problem of how do we pay for things in what we must learn to call the metaverse, but let's just call it the internet for old time's sake. And ever since that initial innovation, the realization that you could use computing power and cryptography to create peer-to-peer payments without third-party verification, a revolution has been gathering momentum that poses a very profound threat to the existing legacy system of banks and fiat currencies. Most money in the world today is made by banks, not central banks, banks. That's what most money is. It's entries in bank accounts. And what Bitcoin represents is an alternative mode of payment that really ought to render banks obsolete. I think this financial revolution has got past the point at which it can be killed. It was vulnerable in the early years, but it now has sufficient adoption and has generated sufficient additional layers. I mean, Ethereum was in many ways the more important innovation because you can build a whole system of payments and ultimately smart contracts on top of Ether. I think we've now reached the point that it's pretty hard to imagine it all being killed. And it's just survived an amazing thing, which was the Chinese shutting down mining and shutting down everything. And still here we are. In fact, crypto's thriving. What we don't know is how much damage ill-judged regulatory interventions are going to do to this financial revolution. Left to its own devices, I think decentralized finance provides the native monetary and financial system for the internet. And the more time we spend in the metaverse, the more use we will make of it. The next things that will happen, I think, will be that tokens in game spaces like Roblox will become fungible. As my 9-year-old spends a lot more time playing on computer games than I ever did, I can see that entertainment is becoming a game-driven phenomenon. And in the game space, you need skins for your avatar. The economics of the internet, it's evolving very fast. And in parallel, you can see this payments revolution happening. I think that all goes naturally very well and generates an enormous amount of wealth in the process. The problem is there are people in Washington with an overwhelming urge to intervene and disrupt this evolutionary process. Partly, I think, out of a muddled sense that there must be a lot of nefarious things going on. If we don't step in, many more will go on. This, I think, greatly exaggerates how much criminal activity is in fact going on in the space. But there's also the vested interests at work. It was odd to me, maybe not odd, perhaps it wasn't surprising, that the Bank for International Settlements earlier this year published a report, one chapter of which said this must all go, must all stop. It's all got to be shut down, and it's got to be replaced by central bank digital currency. Right. And Martin Wolf in the Financial Times read this and said, I agree with this. And one suddenly realized that the banks are clever. They'd achieved the intellectual counterattack with almost no fingerprints on the weapon. I think central bank digital currency is a terrible idea. I can't imagine why we would want to copy a Chinese model that essentially takes all transactions and puts them directly under the surveillance of a central government institution. But that suddenly is a serious counter-proposal. So on the one side, we have a relatively decentralized, technologically innovative, internet-native system of payments that has the possibility to evolve to produce a full set of smart contracts, reducing enormously the transaction costs that we currently encounter in the financial world, because it gets rid of all those middlemen who take their cut every time you take out a mortgage or whatever it is. That's one alternative. But on the other side, we have a highly centralized system in which transactions will by default be under the surveillance of the central bank. Seems like an easy choice to me, but hey, I have this thing about personal liberty. So that's where we are. I don't think that the regulators can kill Web3. I think we're supposed to call it Web3 because crypto is now an obsolescent term. They can't kill it, but they can definitely make it difficult and throw a lot of sand into the machine. And I think worst of all, they can spoil the evolutionary story by creating a central bank digital currency that I don't think we really need. Or we certainly don't need it in the Chinese form.
So do you think Bitcoin has a strong chance to take over the world? So become the primary, you mentioned the three things that make money, become the primary methodology by which we store wealth, we exchange?
No, I think what Bitcoin is, this was a phrase that I got from my friend Matt McLennan at First Eagle, an option on digital gold. So it's the gold of the system, but currently it behaves like an option. That's why it's quite volatile, because we don't really know if this brave new world of crypto is going to work. But if it does work, then Bitcoin is the gold because of the finite supply. What role we need gold to play in the metaverse isn't quite clear.
I love that you're using the term metaverse. This is great.
Well, I just like the metaversity as a kind of as the antithesis of what we're trying to do in Austin. But
I love it.
But can you imagine I'm using it sarcastically? I come from Glasgow, where all novel words have to be used sarcastically. So the metaverse, sarcastic.
But see, the beauty about humor and sarcasm is that the joke becomes reality. I mean, it's like using the word Big Bang to describe the origins of the universe. It becomes like it will.
After a while, it's in the textbooks, and nobody's laughing. Yeah, well, that's exactly right.
Humor is sticky.
Yeah, I'm on the side of humor, but it is a dangerous activity these days. Anyway, I think Bitcoin is the option on digital gold. The role it plays is probably not so much store of value. Right now, it's just nicely not very correlated asset in your portfolio. When I updated the Ascent of Money, which was in 2018, 10 years after it came out, I wrote a new chapter in which I said, Bitcoin, which had just sold off after its 2017 bubble, will rise again through adoption. Because if every millionaire in the world has 0.2% of his or her wealth in Bitcoin, the price should be $15,000. And if it's 1%, it's $75,000. And it might not even stay at 1% because, I mean, look at its recent performance. If your exposure to global stocks had been hedged with a significant crypto holding, you would have aced the last few months. So I think the non-correlation property is very, very important in driving adoption. And the volatility also drives adoption if you're a sophisticated investor. So I think the adoption drives Bitcoin up because it's the option on digital gold, but it's also just this nicely not very correlated asset that you want to hold in a world where, what the hell, I mean, central banks are going to tighten. We've come through this massively disruptive episode of the pandemic. Public debt soared. Money printing soared. you can hang around with your bonds and wait for the euthanasia of the rentier. You can hang on to your tech stocks and just hope there isn't a massive correction, or ... Well, and it seems like a fairly obvious strategy to make sure that you have at least some crypto for the coming year, given what we likely have to face. I think what's really interesting is that on top of Ethereum, a more elaborate financial system is being built. Stable coins are the interesting puzzle for me, because we need off-ramps. Ultimately, you and I have to pay taxes in US dollars. And there's no getting away from that. The IRS is going to let us hold crypto as long as we pay our taxes. And the only question in my mind is, what's the optimal off-ramp to make those tax payments? Probably it shouldn't be a currency invented by Facebook. Never struck me as the best solution to this problem. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's some kind of Fed coin. Or maybe one of the existing algorithmic stablecoins does the job. But we clearly need some stable off-ramp.
So you don't think it's possible for the IRS within the next decade to be accepting Bitcoin as tax payments?
I doubt that. Having dealt with the IRS now since, when did I first come here? 2002. It's hard to think of an institution less likely to leap into the 21st century when it comes to payments. No, I think we'll be tolerated. Crypto world will be tolerated as long as we pay our taxes. And it's important that we're already at that point. And then the next question becomes, well, does Gary Gensler define everything as a security? And do we then have to go through endless regulatory contortions to satisfy the SEC? There's a whole bunch of uncertainties that the administrative state excels at creating, because that's how the administrative state works. You'll do something new. I'll decide whether that's a security, but don't expect me to define it for you. I'll decide in an arbitrary way, and then you'll owe me money. So all of this is going to be very annoying. And, for people who are trying to run exchanges or innovate in the space, these regulations will be annoying. But the problem with fintech is it's different from tech, broadly defined. When tech got into e-commerce with Amazon, when it got into social networking with Facebook, there wasn't a huge regulatory jungle to navigate. But welcome to the world of finance, which has always been a jungle of regulation, because the regulation is there to, basically entrench the incumbents. That's what it's for. So it'll be a much tougher fight than the fights we've seen over other aspects of the tech revolution, because the incumbents are there and they see the threat. And in the end, Satoshi said it very explicitly. It's peer-to-peer payment without third-party verification. And all the third parties are going, wait, what? We're the third parties.
So there is a connection between power and money. You've mentioned World War I from the perspective of money. So power, money, war, authoritarian regimes. From the perspective of money, do you have hope that cryptocurrency can help resist war, can help resist the negative effects of authoritarian regimes? Or is that a silly hope?
Wars happen because the people who have the power to command armed forces miscalculate. That's generally what happens. And we will have a big war in the near future if both the Chinese government and the US government miscalculates and they unleash lethal force on one another. And there's nothing that any financial institution can do to stop that, any more than the Rothschilds could stop World War I. And they were then the biggest bank in the world by far, with massive international financial influence. So let's accept that war is in a different domain. War would impact the financial world massively if it were a war between the United States and China, because there's still a huge China trade on. Wall Street is long China. Europe is long China. So the conflict that I could foresee in the future is one that's highly financially disruptive. Where does crypto fit in? Crypto's obvious utility in the short run is as a store of wealth, of transferable wealth for people who live in dangerous places with failing, not just failing money, but failing rule of law. That's why in Latin America, there's so much interest in crypto, because Latin Americans have a lot of monetary history to look back on, and not much of it is good. So I think that the short run problem that crypto solves is, and this goes back to the digital gold point, if you are in a dangerous place with weak rule of law and weak property rights, here's a new and better way to have portable wealth. I think the next question to ask is, would you want to be long crypto in the event of World War III? What's interesting about that question is that World War III would likely have a significant cyber dimension to it. And I don't want to be 100% in crypto if they crash the internet, which between them, China and Russia might be able to do.
That's a fascinating question, whether you want to be holding physical gold or digital gold in the event of World War III.
The smart person who studied history definitely wants a bit of both. And so let's imagine World War III has a very, very severe cyber component to it with high levels of disruption. Yeah, you'd be glad of the old shiny stuff at that point. So diversification still seems like the most important truth of financial history.
Yeah.
And what is crypto? It's just this wonderful new source of diversification. But you would be nuts to be 100% in Bitcoin. I mean, I have some friends who are probably quite close to that.
Close to 100%. Yeah.
I admire the balls of steel.
Yeah. In whatever way that balls of steel takes form. You mentioned smart contracts. What are your thoughts about, in the context of the history of money, about Ethereum, about smart contracts, about kind of more systematic at scale formalization of agreements between humans?
I think it must be the case that a lot of the complexity in a mortgage is redundant. That when we are confronted with pages and pages and pages and pages of small print, we're seeing some manifestation of the late stage regulatory state. The transaction itself is quite simple. And most of the verbiage is just ass covering by regulators. So I think the smart contract, although I'm sure lawyers will email me and tell me I'm wrong, can deal with a lot of the plain vanilla and maybe not so plain transactions that we want to do and eliminate yet more intermediaries. That's my kind of working assumption. And given that a lot of financial transactions have the potential at least to be simplified, automated, turned into smart contracts, that's probably where the future goes. I can't see an obvious reason why my range of different financial needs, let's think about insurance, for example, will continue to be met with instruments that in some ways are 100 years old. So I think we're still at an early stage of a financial revolution that will greatly streamline how we take care of all those financial needs that we have. Mortgages and insurance leap to mind. You know, most households are penalized for being financially poorly educated and confronted with oligopolistic financial services providers. So you kind of leave college already in debt. So you start in debt servitude, and then you got to somehow lever up to buy a home if you can, because everybody's kind of telling you should do that. So you and your spouse, you are getting even more leveraged, and you're you're long one asset class called real estate, which is super illiquid. I mean, already I'm crying inside at the thought of describing so many households' financial predicament in that way. And I'm not done with them yet because, oh, by the way, there's all this insurance you have to take out. And here are the providers that are willing to insure you. And here are the premiums you're going to be paying, which are kind of presented to you. That's your car insurance, that's your home insurance. And if you're here, it's the earthquake insurance. And pretty soon you're just bleeding money in a bunch of monthly payments to the mortgage lender, to the insurer, to all the other people that lent you money. And let's look at your balance sheet. It sucks. There's this great big chunk of real estate. And what else have you really got on there? And the other side is a bunch of debt, which is probably paying too high interest. The typical household in the median kind of range is at the mercy of oligopolistic financial services providers. Go down further in the social scale, and people are outside the financial system altogether. And those poor folks have to rely on banknotes and informal lending with huge punitive rates. We have to do better than this. This has to be improved upon. And I think what's exciting about our time is that technology now exists that didn't exist when I wrote The Ascent of Money to solve these problems. When I wrote The Ascent of Money, which was in 2008, you couldn't really solve the problem I've just described. Certainly you couldn't solve it with something like microfinance. That was obviously not viable. The interest rates were high, the transaction costs were crazy. But now we have solutions, and the solutions are extremely exciting. So fintech is this great force for good that brings people into the financial system and reduces transaction costs. Crypto is part of it, but it's just part of it. There's a much broader story of fintech going on here where you get financial services on your phone don't cost nearly as much as they did when there had to be a bricks and mortar building on Main Street that you kind of went humbly and beseeched to lend you money. I'm excited about that because it seems to me very socially transformative. I'll give you one other example of what's great. The people who really get scalped in our financial system are senders and receivers of remittances, which are often amongst the poorest families in the world. The people who are, like my wife's family in East Africa, really kind of hand to mouth. And if you send money to East Africa or the Philippines or Central America, the transaction costs are awful. I'm talking to you, Western Union. We're going to solve that problem. So 10 years from now, the transaction costs will just be negligible and the money will go to the people who need it rather than to rent-seeking financial institutions. So I'm on the side of the revolution with this because I think the incumbent financial institutions globally are doing a pretty terrible job, and middle class and lower class families lose out. And thankfully, technology allows us to fix this.
Yeah, so fintech can remove a lot of inefficiencies in the system. I'm super excited myself, maybe as a machine learning person, in data oracles. So converting a lot of our physical world into data, so and have smart contracts on top of that, so that no longer there's this fuzziness about what is the concrete nature of the agreements. You can tie your agreement to weather. You can tie your agreement to the behavior of certain kinds of financial systems. You can tie your behavior to, I don't know, all kinds of things. You can connect it to the body in terms of human sensory information. Like you can make an agreement that if you don't lose 5 pounds in the next month, you're going to pay me $1,000 or something like that. I don't know. It's a stupid example, but it's not, because like you can create all kinds of services on top of that. You can just create all kinds of interesting applications that completely revolutionize how humans transact.
I think, of course, we don't want to create a world of Chinese-style social credit in which our behavior becomes so transparent to providers of financial services, particularly insurers, that when I try to go into the pub, I'm stopped from doing so.
Every time you take a drink, your insurance goes up.
Right, or my credit card won't work in certain restaurants because they serve ribeye steak. I fear that world because I see it being built in China. Yeah. And we must, at all costs, make sure that the Western world has something distinctive to offer. It can't just be, it's the same as in China, only the data go to 5 tech companies rather than to Xi Jinping. So I think the way we need to steer this world is in the way that our data are by default vaulted on our devices, and we choose when to release the data.
Yes.
Rather than the default setting being that the data are available. That's important, I think, because it was one of the biggest mistakes of the evolution of the internet, that in a way the default was to let our data be plundered. It's hard to undo that, but I think we can at least create a new regime that in future makes privacy default rather than open access default.
In the book, Doom, The Politics of Catastrophe, your newest book, you describe wars, pandemics, and the terrible disasters in human history. Which stands out to you as the worst in terms of how much it shook the world and the human spirit?
I am glad I was not around in the mid-14th century when the bubonic plague swept across Eurasia. As far as we can see, that was history's worst pandemic. Maybe there was a comparably bad one in the reign of the Emperor Justinian, but there's some reason to think it wasn't as bad. And the more we learn about the 14th century, the more we realize that it really was across Eurasia, and the mortality was 30%, in some places 50%, in some places higher. There were whole towns that were just emptied. And when one reads about the Black Death, it's an unimaginable nightmare of death and madness in the death, with flagellant orders wandering from town to town, seeking to ward off divine retribution by flogging themselves, people turning on the local Jewish communities as if it's somehow their fault. That must have been a nightmarish time. If you ask me for an also ran a runner-up, it would be World War II in Eastern Europe. And in many ways, it might have been worse, because for a medieval peasant, the sense of being on the wrong side of divine retribution must have been overpowering. In the mid-20th century, you knew that this was man-made murder on a massive industrial scale. If one reads Grossman's Life and Fate, just to take one example, one enters a hellscape that it's extremely hard to imagine oneself in. So these are two of the great disasters of human history. And if we did have a time machine, if one really were able to transport people back and give them a glimpse of these times, I think the post-traumatic stress would be enormous. People would come back from those trips, even if it was a one-day excursion with guaranteed survival, in a state of utter shock.
You often explore counterfactual and hypothetical history, which is a fascinating thing to do, sometimes to a controversial degree. And again, you walk through that fire gracefully. So let me ask maybe about World War II, or in general, what key moments in history of the 20th century do you think, if something else happened at those moments, we could have avoided some of the big atrocities? Stalin's Holodomor, Hitler's Holocaust, Mao's Great Chinese Famine.
The great turning point in world history is August the 2nd, 1914, when the British cabinet decides to intervene, and what would have been a European war becomes a world war. And with British intervention, it becomes a massively larger and more protracted conflict. So very early in my career, I became very preoccupied with the deliberations on that day, and the surprising decision that a Liberal cabinet took to go to war, which you might not have bet on that morning, because there seemed to be a majority of cabinet members who would be disinclined, and only a minority, including Winston Churchill, who wanted to go to war. So that's one turning point. I often wish I could get my time machine working and go back and say, wait, stop. Just think about what you're going to do. And by the way, let me show you a video of Europe in 1918. So that's one.
Can we linger on that one?
Sure.
That one, a lot of people push back on you on because it's so difficult. So the idea is, if I could try to summarize, and you're the first person that made me think about this very uncomfortable thought, which is the idea is, in World War I, it would be a better world if Britain stayed out of the war and Germany won.
Right.
Thinking now in retrospect at the whole story of the 20th century, thinking about Stalin's rule of 30 years, thinking about Hitler's rise to power and the atrocities of the Holocaust, but also, like you said, on the Eastern Front, the death of tens of millions of people through the war, and also sort of the political prisoners and the suffering connected to communism, connected to fascism, all those kinds of things. Well, that's one it's one heck of an example of why you're just like fearless in this particular style of exploring counterfactual history. So can you elaborate on that idea and maybe why this was such an important day in human history?
This argument was central to my book, The Pity of War. I also did an essay in Virtual History about this. And it's always amused me that from around that time, I began to be called a conservative historian, because it's actually a very left-wing argument. The people in 1914 who thought Britain should stay out of the war were the left of the Labour Party, who split to become the Independent Labour Party. What would have happened? Well, first of all, Britain was not ready for war in 1914. There had not been conscription. The army was tiny. So Britain had failed to deter Germany. The Germans took the decision that they could risk going through Belgium, using the Schlieffen Plan to fight their two-front war. They calculated that Britain's intervention would either not happen or not matter. If Britain had been strategically committed to preventing Germany winning a war in Europe, they should have introduced conscription 10 years before, had a meaningful land army, and that would have deterred the Germans. So the Liberal government provided the worst of both worlds, a commitment that was more or less secret to intervene, that the public didn't know about, in fact, much of the Liberal Party didn't know about, but without really the means to make that intervention effective, a tiny army with just a few divisions. So it was perfectly reasonable to argue, as a number of people did on August the 2nd, 1914, that Britain should not intervene. After all, Britain had not immediately intervened against the French revolutionary armies. Back in the 1790s, it had played an offshore role, ultimately intervening, but not immediately intervening. If Britain had stayed out, I don't think that France would have collapsed immediately as it had in 1870. The French held up remarkably well to catastrophic casualties in the first 6 months of the First World War. But by 1916, I don't see how France could have kept going if Britain had not joined the war. And I think the war would have been over perhaps at some point in 1916. We know that Germany's aims would have been significantly limited because they would have needed to keep Britain out. If they'd succeeded in keeping Britain out, they'd have had to keep Britain out. And the way to keep Britain out was obviously not to make any annexation of Belgium, to limit German war aims, particularly to limit them to Eastern Europe. And from Britain's point of view, what was not to like? So the Russian Empire is defeated along with France. What does that really change? If the Germans are sensible, and we can see what this might have looked like, they focus on Eastern Europe, they take chunks of the Russian Empire, perhaps they create, as they did in the Peace of Brest-Litovsk, an independent or quasi-independent Poland. In no way does that pose a threat to the British Empire. In fact, it's a good thing. Britain never had a particularly good relationship with the Russian Empire after all. The key point here is that the Germany that emerges from victory in 1916 has a kind of European Union. It's the dominant power of an enlarged Germany with a significant Mitteleuropa, whatever you want to call it, customs union type arrangement with neighboring countries, including, one suspects, Austria-Hungary. That is a very different world from the world of 1917-18. The protraction of the war for a further 2 years, its globalization, which Britain's intervention made inevitable. As Philip Zelikow showed in his recent book on the failure to make peace in 1916, Woodrow Wilson tried and failed to intervene and broker a peace in 1916. So I'm not the only counterfactualist here. The extension of the war for a further 2 years with escalating slaughter, the death toll rose because the industrial capacity of the armies grew greater. That's what condemns us to the Bolshevik Revolution. And it's what condemns us ultimately to Nazism, because it's out of the experience of defeat in 1918, as Hitler makes clear in Mein Kampf, that he becomes radicalized and enters the political realm. Take out those additional years of war and Hitler's just a failed artist. It's the end of the war that turns him into the demagogue. You asked what are the things that avoid the totalitarian states. As I've said, British non-intervention for me is the most plausible, and it takes out all of that malignant history that follows from the Bolshevik Revolution. It's very hard for me to see how Lenin gets anywhere if the war is over. That looks like the opportunity for the constitutional elements, the liberal elements in Russia. There are other moments at which you can imagine history taking a different path. If the provisional government in Russia had been more ruthless, it was very lenient towards the Bolsheviks, but if it had just rounded them up and shot the Bolshevik leadership, that would have certainly cut the Bolshevik Revolution off. One looks back on the conduct of the Russian liberals with the kind of despair at their failure to see the scale of the threat that they faced and the ruthlessness that the Bolshevik leadership would evince. There's a counterfactual in Germany, which is interesting. I think the Weimar Republic destroyed itself in two disastrous economic calamities, the inflation and then the deflation. It's difficult for me to imagine Hitler getting to be Reich Chancellor without those huge economic disasters. So another part of my early work explored alternative policy options that the German Republic, the Weimar Republic, might have pursued. There are other contingencies that spring to mind. In 1936 or 38, I think more plausibly 38, Britain should have gone to war. The great mistake was Munich. Hitler was in an extremely vulnerable position in 1938 because remember, he didn't have Russia squared away as he would in 1939. Chamberlain's mistake was to fold instead of going for war, as Churchill rightly saw, and there was a magical opportunity there that would have played into the hands of the German military opposition and conservatives to snuff Hitler out over Czechoslovakia. I could go on. The point is that history is not some inexorable narrative which can only end one way. It's a garden of forking paths. And at many, many junctions in the road, there were choices that could have averted the calamities of the mid-20th century.
I have to ask you about this moment before you said I could go on. This moment of Chamberlain and Hitler, snuff Hitler out in terms of Czechoslovakia. And we'll return to the book Doom on this point. What does it take to be a great leader in the room with Hitler or in the same time and space as Hitler, to snuff him out, to make the right decisions? What is, so it sounds like you put quite a bit of the blame on the man, Chamberlain, and give credit to somebody like a Churchill. So what is the difference? Where's that line? You've also written a book about Henry Kissinger, who's an interesting sort of person that's been throughout many difficult decisions in the games of power. So what does it take to be a great leader in that moment? That particular moment, sorry to keep talking, is fascinating to me because it feels like it's man-on-man conversations that define history.
Well, Hitler was bluffing. He really wasn't ready for war in 1938. The German economy was clearly not ready for war in 1938. And Chamberlain made a fundamental miscalculation along with his advisors, because it wasn't all Chamberlain. He was in many ways articulating the establishment view. And I tried to show in a book called War of the World how that establishment worked. It extended through the BBC, into the aristocracy, to Oxford. There was an establishment view. Chamberlain personified it. Churchill was seen as a warmonger. He was at his lowest point of popularity in 1938. But what is it that Chamberlain gets wrong? Because it's conceptual. Chamberlain is persuaded that Britain has to play for time, because Britain is not ready for war in 1938. He fails to see that the time that he gets, that he buys at Munich, is also available to Hitler. Everybody gets the time, and Hitler's able to do much more with it because Hitler strikes the pact with Stalin that guarantees that Germany can fight a war on one front in 1939. What does Chamberlain do? Builds some more aircraft. So the great mistake of the strategy of appeasement was to play for time. I mean, they knew war was coming, but they were playing for time, not realizing that Hitler got the time too. And after he partitioned Czechoslovakia, he was in a much stronger position, not least because of all the resources that they were able to plunder from Czechoslovakia. So that was the conceptual mistake. Churchill played an heroic role in pointing out this mistake and predicting accurately that it would lead to war on worse terms. What does it take? It takes a distinct courage to be unpopular. And Churchill was deeply unpopular at that point. People would listen to him in the House of Commons in silence. On one occasion, Lady Astor shouted, "Rubbish!" So he went through a period of being hated on. Yeah. The other thing that made Churchill a formidable leader was that he always applied history to the problem. And that's why he gets it right. He sees the historical problem much more clearly than Chamberlain. So I think if you go back to 1938, there's no realistic counterfactual in which Churchill's in government in 1938. You have to have France collapse for Churchill to come into government. But you can certainly imagine a Tory elite that's thinking more clearly about the likely dynamics. They haven't seen this, I guess, problem of conjecture, to take a phrase from Kissinger, which is that whatever they're doing in postponing the war has the potential to create a worse starting point for the war. It would have been risky in 1938, but it was a way better situation than they ended up with in 1939, a year later. You asked about Kissinger, and I've learned a lot from reading Kissinger and talking to Kissinger since I embarked on writing his biography a great many years ago. I think one of the most important things I've learned is that you can apply history to contemporary problems. It may be the most important tool that we have in that kind of decision-making. You have to do it quite ruthlessly and rigorously. And in the moment of crisis, you have to take risk. So, Kissinger often says in his early work, the temptation of the bureaucrat is to wait for more data. But ultimately, the decision-making that we do under uncertainty can't be based on data. The problem of conjecture is that you could take an action now and incur some cost and avert disaster, but you'll get no thanks for it because nobody is grateful for an averted disaster. Mm-hmm. And nobody goes around saying, wasn't it wonderful how we didn't have another 9/11? On the other hand, you can do nothing, incur no upfront costs, and hope for the best. And you might get lucky, the disaster might not happen. That's, in a democratic system, the much easier path to take. And I think the essence of leadership is to be ready to take that upfront cost, avert the disaster, and accept that you won't get gratitude.
If I may make a comment, an aside about Henry Kissinger. So he, I think at 98 years old currently, has still got it.
Yeah.
He's brilliant.
It's very, very impressive. I can only hope that my brain has the same durability that his does, because it's a formidable intellect and it's still in as sharp form as it was 50 years ago.
So you mentioned Eric Schmidt's in his book. They reached out to me that they want to do this podcast. And I know Eric Schmidt. I've spoken to him before. I like him a lot, obviously. So they said we could do a podcast for 40 minutes with Eric, 40 minutes with Eric and Henry together, and 40 minutes with Henry. So those are 3 different conversations. And I had to do some soul searching. Because I said, fine, 40 minutes with Eric. We'll probably talk many times again. Fine, let's talk about this AI book together for 40 minutes. But I said, what I wrote to them, I said, I would hate myself if I only have 40 minutes to talk to Henry Kissinger. And so I had to hold my ground, went back and forth, and in the end decided to part ways over this. And I sometimes think about this kind of difficult decision in the podcasting space of when do you walk away? Because there's a particular world leader that I've mentioned in the past where the conversation is very likely to happen. And as it happens, those conversations can often be, unfortunately, this person only has 30 minutes now. I know we agreed for 3 hours, but unfortunately, and you have to decide, do I stand my ground on this point? I suppose that's the thing that journalists have to think about, right? Like, do I hold on to my integrity in whatever form that takes? And do I stay my ground even if I lose a fascinating opportunity? Anyway, it's something I thought about and something I think about. And with Henry Kissinger, I mean, he's had a million amazing conversations in your biography, so it's not like something is lost. But it was still, nevertheless, to me, some soul searching that I had to do as a kind of practice for what to me is a higher stakes conversation. I'll just mention is Vladimir Putin. I can have a conversation with him unlike any conversation he's ever had, partially because I'm a fluent Russian speaker, partially because I'm messed up in the head in certain kind of ways that make for an interesting dynamic, because we're both judo people. We both are certain kinds of human beings that can have a much deeper apolitical conversation. I have to ask, to stay on the topic of leadership, you've, in your book Doom, have talked about wars, pandemics throughout human history, and in some sense saying that all of these disasters are man-made. So humans have a role in terms of the magnitude of the effect that they have on human civilization. Without taking cheap political shots, can we talk about COVID-19? How will history remember the COVID-19 pandemic? What were the successes? What were the failures of leadership, of man, of humans?
Doom was a book that I was planning to write before the pandemic struck, as a history of the future based in large measure on science fiction. It had occurred to me in 2019 that I had spent too long not reading science fiction, and so I decided I would liven up my intake by getting off history for a bit and reading science fiction. Because history is great at telling you about the perennial problems of power. Putin is always interesting on history. He's become something of a historian recently with his essays and lectures. But what history is bad at telling you is, well, what will the effects of discontinuity of technology be? And so I thought I need some science fiction to think more about this, because I'm tending to miss the importance of technological discontinuity. If you read a lot of science fiction, you read a lot of plague books, because science fiction writers are really quite fond of the plague scenario. So the world ends in many ways in science fiction, but one of the most popular is the lethal pandemic. So when the first email came to me, I think it was on January the 3rd from my medical friend Justin Stebbing, funny pneumonia in Wuhan, my antennae began to tingle, because it was just like one of those science fiction books that begins in just that way. In a pandemic, as Larry Brilliant, the epidemiologist, said many years ago, the key is early detection and early action. That's how you deal with a novel pathogen. And almost no Western country did that. We know it was doable because the Taiwanese and the South Koreans did it, and they did it very well. But really no Western country got this right. Some were unlucky because super spreader events happened earlier than in other countries. Italy was hit very hard very early. For other countries, the real disaster came quite late. Russia, which has only relatively recently had a really bad experience. The lesson for me is quite different from the one that most journalists thought they were learning last year. Most journalists last year thought, Trump is a terrible president. He's saying a lot of crazy things. It's his fault that we have high excess mortality in the United States. The same argument was being made by journalists in Britain, Boris Johnson, ... Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, ... even India, Narendra Modi. The same argument. And I think this argument is wrong in a few ways. It's true that the populist leaders said many crazy things and, broadly speaking, gave poor guidance to their populations. But I don't think it's true to say that with different leaders, these countries would have done significantly better. If Joe Biden had magically been president a year earlier, I don't think the US would have done much better, because the things that caused excess mortality last year weren't presidential decisions. They were utter failure of CDC to provide testing. That definitely wasn't Trump's fault. Scott Gottlieb's book makes that very clear. It's just been published recently. We utterly failed to use technology for contact tracing, which the Koreans did very well. We didn't really quarantine anybody seriously. There was no enforcement of quarantine. And we exposed the elderly to the virus as quickly as possible in elderly care homes. And these things had very little to do with presidential incompetence. So I think leadership is of somewhat marginal importance in a crisis like this, because what you really need is your public health bureaucracy to get it right. And very few Western public health bureaucracies got it right. Could the president have given better leadership? Yes. His correct strategy, however, was to learn from Barack Obama's playbook with the opioid epidemic. The opioid epidemic killed as many people on Obama's watch as COVID did on Trump's watch. And it was worse in a sense because it only happened in the US, and each year it killed more people than the year before, over 8 years. Nobody, to my knowledge, has ever seriously blamed Obama for the opioid epidemic. Trump's mistake was to put himself front and center of the response, to claim that he had some unique insight into the pandemic, and to say, with every passing week, more and more foolish things, until even a significant portion of people who'd voted for him in 2016 realized that he'd blown it, which was why he lost the election. The correct strategy was actually to make Mike Pence the pandemic czar and get the hell out the way. That's what my advice to Trump would have been. In fact, it was in February of last year. So the mistake was to try to lead. But actually, leadership in a pandemic is almost a contradiction in terms. What you really need is your public health bureaucracy not to fuck it up. And they really, really fucked it up. And that was then all blamed on Trump.
Yes.
You know, Jim Fallows writes a piece in The Atlantic that says, well, being the president's like flying a light aircraft, it's pilot error. And I read that piece and I thought, does he really, after all the years he spent writing, think that being president is like flying a light aircraft? I mean, it's really nothing like flying a light aircraft. Being president is you sit on top of a vast bureaucracy with how many different agencies, 60, 70, we've all lost count. And you're surrounded by advisors, at least a quarter of whom are saying, this is a disaster, we have to close the borders. And the others are saying, no, we have to keep the economy going. That's what you're running on in November. So being the president in a pandemic is a very unenviable position because you actually can't really determine whether you're public health bureaucracy will get it right or not.
You don't think, to push back on that, just like being Churchill in a war is difficult. So leaving Trump and Biden aside, what I would love to see from a president is somebody who makes great speeches and arouses the public to push the bureaucracy, the public health bureaucracy, to get their shit together, to fire certain kinds of people. I'm sorry, but I'm a big fan of powerful speeches, especially in the modern age with the internet. It can really move people. Instead, the lack of speeches resulted in certain kinds of forces amplifying division over whether to wear masks or not, or all. It's almost like the public picked some random topic over which to divide themselves, and there was like a complete indecision, which is really what it was: fear of uncertainty materializing itself in some kind of division, and then you almost like busied yourself with the red versus blue politics, as opposed to some, I don't know, FDR type character just stands and say, fuck all this bullshit that we're hearing. We're going to manufacture 5 billion tests. This is what America is great at. We're going to build the greatest testing infrastructure ever built, or something, or even with the vaccine development.
But that was what I was about to interject.
Yes.
In a pandemic, the most important thing is the vaccine. If you get that right, then you should be forgiven for much else. And that was the one thing the Trump administration got right, because they went around the bureaucracy with Operation Warp Speed and achieved a really major success. So I think the paradox of the 2020 story in the United States is that the one thing that mattered most, the Trump administration got right. And it got so much else wrong that was sort of marginal that we were left with the impression that Trump had been to blame for the whole disaster, which wasn't really quite right. Sure, it would have been great if we did Operation Warp Speed for testing, but ultimately vaccines are more important than tests. And this brings me to the question that you raised there of polarization and why that happened. Now, in a book called The Square in the Tower, I argued that it would be very costly for the United States to allow the public sphere to continue to be dominated by a handful of big tech companies, that this ultimately would have more adverse effects than simply contested elections. And I think we saw over the past 18 months just how bad this could be, because the odd thing about this country is that we came up with vaccines with 90+% efficacy, and about 20% of people refused to get them and still do refuse, for reasons that seem best explained in terms of the anti-vax network, which has been embedded on the internet for a long time, predating the pandemic. René DeResta wrote about this pre-2020. And this anti-vax network has turned out to kill maybe 200,000 Americans who could have been vaccinated but were persuaded through magical thinking that the vaccine was riskier than the virus. Whereas you don't need to be an epidemiologist, you don't need to be a medical scientist to know that the virus is about 2 orders of magnitude riskier than the vaccine. So again, leadership could definitely have been better, but the politicization of everything was not Trump's doing alone. It happened because our public sphere has been dominated by a handful of platforms whose business model inherently promotes polarization, inherently promotes fake news and extreme views, because those are the things that get the eyeballs on the screens and sell the ads. I mean, this is now a commonplace, but when one thinks about the cost of allowing this kind of thing to happen, it's now a very high human cost. And we were foolish to leave uncorrected these structural problems in the public sphere that were already very clearly visible in 2016.
And you described that, like you mentioned, that there's these networks that are almost like laying dormant, waiting for their time in the sun, and they stepped forward in this case. And that those network effects just they serve as catalyst for whatever the bad parts of human nature. I do hope that there's kinds of networks that emphasize the better angels of our nature, to quote Steven Pinker.
Well, it's just clearly, and we know this from all the revelations of the Facebook whistleblower, there is clearly a very clear tension between the business model of a company like Facebook and the public good. And they know that.
I just talked to the founder of Instagram. Yes, that's the case, but it's not, from a technology perspective, like absolutely true of any kind of social network. I think it's possible to build. Actually, I think it's not just possible. I think it's pretty easy if you set that as the goal, to build social networks that don't have these negative effects.
Right. But if the business model is we sell ads, and the way you sell ads is to maximize user engagement, then the algorithm is biased in favor of fake news and extreme views.
But it's not the ads. A lot of people blame the ads. The problem, I think, is the engagement, and the engagement is just the easiest, the dumbest way to sell the ads. I think there's much different metrics that could be used to make a lot more money than the engagement in the long term. It has more to do with planning for the long term. So optimizing the selling of ads to make people happy with themselves in the long term, as opposed to some kind of addicted, like, dopamine feeling. And so that's, to me, that has to do with metrics and measuring things correctly, and sort of also creating a culture with what's valued, to have difficult conversations about what we're doing with society, all those kinds of things. And I think once you have those conversations, this takes us back to the University of Austin kind of, once you have those difficult human conversations, you can design the technology that will actually make for, help people grow, become the best version of themselves, help them be happy in the long term. What gives you hope about the future? As somebody who studied some of the darker moments of human history, what gives you hope?
A couple of things. First of all, the United States has a very unique operating system, which was very well designed by the founders, who'd thought a lot about history and realized it would take quite a novel design to prevent the republic going the way of all republics, because republics tend to end up as tyrannies for reasons that were well established by the time of the Renaissance. And it gives me hope that this design has worked very well and withstood an enormous stress test in the last year. I became an American in 2018. I think one of the most important features of this operating system is that it is the magnet for talent. Here we sit, part of the immigration story, in a darkened room with funny accents, talking.
Scott and a Russian walk
into a recording studio and talk about America. It's very much like a joke. And Elon's a South African, and so on, and Nialll is a German, and we're extraordinarily fortunate that the natives let us come and play, and play in a way that we could not in our countries of birth. And as long as the United States continues to exploit that superpower, that it is the talent magnet, then it should out-innovate the totalitarian competition every time. So that's one reason for being an optimist. Another reason, and it's quite a historical reason, as you would expect from me, another reason that I'm optimistic is that my kids give me a great deal of hope. They range in age from 27 down to 4. But each of them, in their different way, seems to be finding a way through this crazy time of ours without losing contact with that culture and civilization that I hold dear. I don't want to live in the metaverse as Mark Zuckerberg imagines it. To me, that's a kind of ghastly hell. I think Western civilization is the best civilization, and I think that almost all the truths about the human condition can be found in Western literature, art, and music. And I think also that the the civilization that produced the scientific revolution has produced the great problem-solving tool that eluded the other civilizations that never really cracked science. And what gives me hope is that despite all the temptations and distractions that their generation had to contend with, my children in their different ways have found their way to literature and to art and to music, and they are civilized. And I don't claim much of the credit for that. I've done my best, but I think it's deeply encouraging that they found their way to the things that I think are indispensable for a happy life, a fulfilled life. Nobody, I think, can be truly fulfilled if they're cut off from the great body of Western literature, for example. I've thought a lot about Elon's argument that we might be in a simulation. No, there is a simulation. It's called literature. And we just have to decide whether or not to enter it. I'm currently in the midst of the later stages of Proust's great À la recherche du temps perdu. And Proust's observation of human relationships is perhaps more meticulous than that of any other writer. And it's impossible not to find yourself identifying with Marcel and his obsessive, jealous relationships, particularly with Albertine. It's the simulation. And you decide, I think, as a sentient being, how far to, in your own life, reenact these more profound experiences that others have written down. One of my earliest literary simulations was to reenact Jack Kerouac's trip in On the Road when I was 17, culminating in getting very wasted in the hanging gardens of Xochimilco, not to be missed. And it hit me just as I was reading Proust that that's really how to live a rich life. That one lives life, but one lives it juxtaposing one's own experience against the more refined experiences of the great writers. So it gives me hope that my children do that a bit.
Do you include the Russian authors
very much
in the canon?
Yes, I don't read Russian, but I was entirely obsessed with Russian literature as a schoolboy. I read my way through Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Turgenev, Chekhov. I think of all of those writers, Tolstoy had the biggest impact because at the end of War and Peace, there's this great essay on historical determinism, which I think was the reason I became a historian. But I'm really temperamentally a kind of Turgenev person, oddly enough. I think if you haven't read those novelists, I mean, you can't really be a complete human being if you haven't read the Brothers Karamazov. You're not grown up. And so I think in many ways those are the greatest novels. Remember Raskolnikov's nightmare at the end of Crime and Punishment, in which he imagines in his dream a world in which a terrible virus spreads. Do you remember this? Mm-hmm. And this virus has the effect of making every individual think that what he believes is right. And in this self-righteousness, people fall on one another and commit appalling violence. Mm. That's Raskolnikov's nightmare, and it's a prophecy. It's a terrible prophecy of Russia's future.
Yeah, it's and coupled with that is probably I also like the French, the existentialist, all that. The full spectrum, and Germans, Hermann Hesse, and just that range of human thought as expressed in literature is fascinating. I really love your idea that the simulation, like one way to live life is to kind of explore these other worlds and borrow from them.
Yes.
Wisdom that you then just map onto your own life. So you almost like stitch together your life with these kind of pieces from literature.
The highly educated person is constantly struck by illusion. Everything is an illusion to something that one has read. And that is the simulation. That's what the real metaverse is. It's the imaginary world that we enter when we read, empathize, and then recognize in our daily lives some scrap of the shared experience that literature gives us.
Yeah, I think I've aspired to be the idiot from Prince Mishkin from Dostoevsky, and in aspiring to be that, I have become the idiot, I feel, at least in part. What you mentioned, the human condition, does love have to do? What role does it play in the human condition? Friendship, love.
Love is the drug. Love
kind?
is, this was a great Roxy Music line that Brian Ferry wrote. And love is the most powerful and dangerous of all the drugs. The driving force that overrides our reason. And of course, it is the primal urge. So what a civilized society has to do is to prevent that drug, that primal force, from creating mayhem. So there have to be rules, like monogamy and rituals like marriage that rein love in and make the addict at least more or less under control. And I think that's part of why I'm a romantic rather than a Steve Pinker Enlightenment rationalist, because the romantics realized that love was the drug. It's like the difference in sensibility between Handel and Wagner. And I had a Wagnerian phase when I was an undergraduate, and I still remember thinking that in Isolde's Liebestod, that Wagner had got the closest to sex that anybody had ever got in music, or perhaps to love. I'm lucky that I love my wife, and that we were, by the time we met, smart enough to understand that love is a drug that you have to kind of take in certain careful ways, and that it works best in the context of a stable family. That's the key thing, that one has to sort of take the drug and then submit to the conventions of marriage and family life. I think in that respect, I'm a kind of tamed romantic.
Tamed romantic.
That's how I'd like to think of myself.
And the degree to which your romanticism is tamed can be then channeled into productive work. That's why you're a historian and a writer, is the rest of that love is channeled through the writing.
So if you're going to be addicted to anything, be addicted to work. I mean, we're all addictive, but the thing about workaholism is that it is the most productive addiction. And and rather that than drugs or booze. So I'm always trying to channel my anxieties into work. I learnt that at a relatively early age. It's a sort of massively productive way of coping with the inner demons. And again, we should teach kids that, because let's come back to our earlier conversation about universities. Part of what happens at university is that adolescents have to overcome all the inner demons. And these include deep insecurity about one's appearance, about one's intellect, and then madly raging hormones that cause you to behave like a complete fool with the people to whom you're sexually attracted. All of this is going on in a university. How can it be a safe space? It's a completely dangerous space by definition.
Yeah.
So I learned teaching young people how to manage these storms. That's part of the job, and we're really not allowed to do that anymore, because we can't talk about these things for fear of the Title IX officers kicking down the door and dragging us off in chains.
And like you said, hard work and something you call work ethic in civilization is a pretty effective way to achieve, I think, a kind of happiness in a world that's full of anxiety. So,
or at least exhaustion, so that you sleep well.
well, there's beauty to the exhaustion too. There's why running, there's manual work. That some part of us is built for that.
Right. I mean, we are products of evolution, and our adaptation to a technological world is a very imperfect one. So, hence the kind of masochistic urge to run. I like outdoor exercise. I don't really like gyms, so I'll go for long, punishing runs in woodland, hike up hills. I like swimming in lakes and in the sea, because there just has to be that physical activity in order to do the good mental work. And so it's all about trying to do the best work. That's my sense, that we have some random allocation of talent. You kind of figure out what it is that you're relatively good at, and you try to do that well. I think my father encouraged me to think that way. And you don't mind about being average at the other stuff. The kind of sick thing is to try to be brilliant at everything. I hate those people. You should really not worry too much if you're just an average double bass player, which I am, or kind of average skier, which I definitely am. Doing those things okay is part of leading a rich and fulfilling life. I was not a good actor, but I got a lot out of acting as an undergraduate. It turned out after 3 years of experimentation at Oxford that I was, broadly speaking, better at writing history essays than my peers, and that was my edge. That was my comparative advantage. And so I've just tried to make a living from that slight edge.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to describe a life. Is there a meaning to this thing? Is there a meaning to life? What is the meaning of life?
I was brought up by a physicist and a physician. They were more or less committed atheists who had left the Church of Scotland as a protest against sectarianism in Glasgow. And so my sister and I were told from an early age life was a cosmic accident. And that was it. There was no great meaning to it. And I can't really get past that.
Isn't there beauty to being an accident at a cosmic scale?
Yes, I wasn't taught to feel negative about that. And if anything, it was a frivolous insight that the whole thing was a kind of joke. And I think that atheism isn't really a basis for ordering a society, but it's been all right for me. I don't have a kind of sense of a missing religious faith. For me, however, there's clearly some embedded Christian ethics in the way my parents lived. And so we were kind of atheist Calvinists who had kind of deposed God but carried on behaving as if we were members of the elect in a moral universe. So that's kind of the state of mind that, that I was left in. And I think that we aren't really around long enough to claim that our individual lives have meaning. But what Edmund Burke said is true. The real social contract is between the generations, between the dead, the living, and the unborn. And the meaning of life is, for me at least, to live in a way that honors the dead, seeks to learn from their accumulated wisdom, because they do still outnumber us. They outnumber the living by quite a significant margin. And then to be mindful of the unborn and our responsibility to them. Writing books is a way of communicating with the unborn. It may or may not succeed, and probably won't succeed if my books are never assigned by woke professors in the future. So what we have to do is more than just write books and record podcasts. There have to be institutions. I'm 57 now. I realized recently that succession planning had to be the main focus of the next 20 years, because there are things that I really care about that I want future generations to have access to. And so the meaning of life I do regard as being intergenerational transfer of wisdom. Ultimately, the species will go extinct at some point. Even if we do colonize Mars, one senses that physics will catch up with this particular organism, but it's in the pretty far distant future. And so the meaning of life is to make sure that for as long as there are human beings, they are able to live the kind of fulfilled lives, ethically fulfilled, intellectually fulfilled, emotionally fulfilled lives that civilization has made possible. It would be easy for us to revert to the uncivilized world. There's a fantastic book that I'm going to misremember, Milosz's The Captive Soul, The Captive Mind, rather, which has a fantastic passage. He was a Polish intellectual who says, Americans can never imagine what it's like for civilization to be completely destroyed, as it was in Poland by the end of World War II, to have no rule of law, to have no security of even person, never mind property rights. They can't imagine what that's like and what it will lead you to do. So one reason for teaching history is to remind the lucky Generation Z members of California that civilization is a thin film and it can be destroyed remarkably easily. And to preserve civilization is a tremendous responsibility that we have. It's a huge responsibility. And we must not destroy it ourselves, whether it's in the name of wokeism or the pursuit of the metaverse. Preserving civilization and making it available, not just to our kids, but to people we'll never know, generations ahead. That's the meaning.
And do so by studying the lessons of history.
Right. Not only studying them, but then acting on them. For me, the biggest problem is, how do we apply history more effectively? It seems as if our institutions, including government, are very, very bad at applying history. Lessons of history are learnt poorly, if at all. Analogies are drawn crudely. Often the wrong inferences are drawn. One of the big intellectual challenges for me is how to make history more useful. And this was the kind of thing that professors used to hate, but really practically useful, so that policymakers and citizens can think about the decisions that they face with a more historically informed body of knowledge, whether it's a pandemic, the challenge of climate change, what to do about Taiwan. I can't think of a better set of things to know before you make decisions about those things than the things that history has to offer.
Well, I love the discipline of applied history, basically going to history and saying, what are the key principles here that are applicable to the problems of today?
Right.
And how can we solve that?
The great philosopher of history, R.G. Collingwood, said in his autobiography, which was published in 1939, that the purpose of history was to reconstitute past thought from whatever surviving remnants there were, and then to juxtapose it with our own predicament. And that's that juxtaposition of past experience with present experience that is so important. We don't do that well. And indeed, we've flipped it so that academic historians now think their mission is to travel back to the past with the value system of 2021 and castigate the dead for their racism and sexism and transphobia and whatnot. And I mean, that's exactly wrong. Our mission is to go back and try to understand what it was like to live in the 18th century, not to go back and condescend to the people of the past. And once we've had a better understanding, once we've seen into their lives, read their words, tried to reconstitute their experience, to come back and understand our own time better. That's what we should really be doing. But academic history's gone completely haywire, and it does almost the exact opposite of what I think it should do.
And by studying history, walk beautifully, gracefully through this simulation, as you described, by mapping the lessons of history into the world of today.
We have virtual reality already in our heads. We do not need Oculus.
in the metaverse. This was an incredible, hopeful conversation in many ways that I did not expect. I thought our conversation would be much more about history than about the future, and it turned out to be the opposite. Thank you so much for talking today. It's a huge honor to finally meet you, to talk to you. Thank you for your valuable time.
Thank you, Lex, and good luck with Putin.
Thanks for listening to this conversation with Nialll Ferguson. To support this podcast, please check out our sponsors in the description. And now, let me leave you with some words from Nialll Ferguson himself. No civilization, no matter how mighty it may appear to itself, is indestructible. Thank you for listening, and hope to see you next time.